Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this debate on the ecological transition, a driver for innovation. This afternoon, to talk about all of this, we have Patrice GEOFFRON, who's the professor at the University Paris Dauphine. He's going to set the stage. And around the table, we have heads of companies, Veolia, Solvay, EDF, ENGIE, and we also have specialists on the climate, a very well-known specialist, Valérie MASSON-DELMOTTE, who is from the IPCC, and we have the climate ambassador from Denmark, Tomas Anker Christensen, who's going to give us the point of view from the Scandinavian countries. So, Patrice, if you'd like to set the stage and present the topic to us on this issue of ecological transition and progress. How can we reconcile ecological transition and the need to have growth and to make economic progress? Yes, thank you, Nicolas. I'd firstly like to thank, on behalf of my colleagues from the Cercle des économistes, for being able to be here. We're talking in different conditions. So this year is a bit of a different year. It's the 20-year anniversary of these meetings, but it's also very specific for other reasons. So the question that we can ask is, should ecological transition be a driver for innovation? And I believe that if we delve into this topic, it's impossible to answer no. The first element I want to share with you and our listeners, the obligation to guide Europeans to be carbon neutral by 2050, so we shouldn't be emitting more CO2 than the ability than we have to capture the CO2. So based on that, we have to come up with breakthroughs. We have very little time to get away from the model that we're living in right now. This effort's going to have to be made by companies that are here around the table, but if this transition is drastic, no activities of business can get away from this objective and the innovations that go hand in hand with it. I'm a university professor, and right now in universities we're thinking about pedagogical tools that we can use to take into account these environmental dimensions in the way we teach and the way we work with them. So I'm going to remind you of something that's obvious to begin with. I won't list them all. We'll be going through them in the discussion, but there are three specific ones that we need to look at in the current context. One of these conditions is that we can't get away from the economic calculation concerning these innovations. These innovations are essentially devoted to reducing CO2 emissions, but they'll also produce co-benefits that we tend to neglect. The co-benefits can be improvement in air quality. We're coming out of a health crisis, at least I hope we are, where air quality improved for France. Air pollution each year costs between 50 and 100 billion euros, 4% of our GDP. And we can't neglect that dimension in the future. We need to take into account the benefits that we have for our community thanks to these innovations. My second observation concerns the implementation conditions. Industrial companies have to talk about their efforts more, and they do it through the obligations that they have for carbon accounting and the objective for carbon neutrality. There's been huge announcements made, including by major European oil companies, but they have to talk about their activity, the development of their activities, and innovation. Today I was very attentive to a certain number of sessions. Some were very interesting, and this morning I heard Stéphane Richard, the head of Orange, give us some figures that maybe we need to examine further, but the CO2 emissions of the mobile telephone emissions correspond to 1/10 of the emissions that they avoid. So there's substitution perhaps through transport activities. Antoine FREROT seems to be doubting. But I think that these orders of size need to be taken into account in the beyond just accounting for carbon emissions. And the head of Atos also gave other orders of size that go in the same direction. So the contribution to the effort that we're making has to be clearer in the public debate so that it's clearer to our co-citizens and consumers. And thirdly, my third point concerns the citizens conference on the climate. It ended at the Élysée Palace on Monday. You were one of the experts involved. Yes. I was there to help answer the citizens' questions and to watch them work. This experience was very interesting. And this citizens' convention came out of the Yellow Jackets movement that led to this consultation. And the mandate given to our citizens in the convention was twofold. Firstly, they had to determine measures that could be consistent with France's commitment to reduce CO2 emissions by 40% by 2030, and they'd be acceptable at a social level, and that's going to be at the heart of the debate. So we need to look at how we're going to implement these innovations, just to summarize. So the IPCC watches what we do. Sometimes you announce bad news, prospects for the future that are a bit complicated. What's the ecological transition for you? As I see this from the point of view of climate change, the question is, how can we adapt to climate change that's inevitable over the next decades, given the inertia that exists and the infrastructure that's already in place? And then there's a question on greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. And I think we need to get out of our silos. The government action was separate. On one hand, we were reducing greenhouse gas emissions with low carbon emissions, and there were other actions for adaptation. And we need to start thinking differently. We need to build development paths, social development, economic development paths that are resilient to shocks. Global warming is one, a pandemic is another. So we need a model that's resilient, that goes to carbon sobriety, that's so essential if we want to stabilize the global warming in the next decades, and also to allow us to preserve biodiversity and enabling citizens to live with dignity. So how can we look at this from the climate and biodiversity point of view? I think we need to look at training and education. A lot of students in engineering schools are looking for competencies to be able to propose concrete solutions that we can deploy rapidly. Innovations in terms of governance. Let's take an example. The report from the High Council for the Climate, the IPCC. So we need to have methodologies to be able to do studies to measure things properly for greenhouse gas emissions or for adaptation measures, for the sustainable development objectives also. So the new report will come out next week, and it underscores the importance of territories in governance. It's at all levels. And then there's technological innovation. Other stakeholders around the table are on the front line to talk about this. Social innovation, the sharing economy can be a social innovation. There are some solutions based on nature. If you want to manage the water level rising on the coast, you can restore the coastal ecosystems. That could help. You could also create green islands, cooling islands in cities. That could be part of the solution. And to conclude, there's innovation that I call frugal innovation, repairable products with longer life cycles, but also innovation that's accessible to all, accessible in all countries of the world, even with low standards of living, where they need to have access to energy to live with dignity. And a frugal innovation that can be accessible to all of us here, too. Regardless of one's revenue, we can propose solutions and use new solutions. So this ecological transition I see as a transition to new production systems, energy, but also the use of land, urbanization, industry, infrastructure that are necessary. And I also see it as a question of societal transformation. So I think we're connected with the ambassador for, the climate ambassador for Denmark. Can you hear me? Good day, sir. We would like to hear your opinion on this question and to have your point of view on the connection that you make between ecological transition and innovation.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you. I look forward to meeting you all in Aix, either sur Seine or en Provence next year. It's quite ironic that at the time of the lockdown in Europe in March, we were actually heading for takeoff in terms of boosting ambition on climate action as we were heading towards COP26 in Glasgow. And there is a disconnect between the political ambition and the ambition in the real economy, also represented, I think, by the companies around your table. The political ambition is simply not as strong and as far ahead in terms of reaching the 2030 or 2050 targets that we need to achieve in order to make the transition on time. And we have to ramp up political ambition to be on track to achieve the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. But we have very little time left. It's a narrow window of opportunity. And we have to transition not only energy, but also transport and food systems, nature, basically the systems that drive the global economy and emissions. In the spirit of the upcoming 14th of July, you could say that we need a revolution in decarbonization, and we need to ramp up innovation to do so. In Denmark, we are focusing on linking the recovery out of the COVID crisis and the European Green Deal together so that we build recovery and ambition at the same time. And there are trillions of euros being invested into this recession that need to be green, both at national level in Denmark and France, but also at European level. Otherwise, we will run out of fiscal space, political will, and time to manage the climate crisis. So my three simple messages for you is that we need ambition, ambition, and ambition. Ambition as governments, setting policies commensurate with Paris Agreement, also on innovation. Otherwise, carbon neutrality in 2050 is not achievable. In Denmark, we have just adopted a new law setting by law that we need to achieve 70% reduction by 2030. And in doing so, we will do a full total decarbonization of our energy system, full electrification of the economy, and major investments in innovation and capacity building, especially into power to X and hydrogen technology. But you also need ambition as business and investors. You need to set targets aligned with Paris, zero net emissions by 2015, driving it through your value chain, your supply chain, and you need to help set ambitious targets for all sectors of the economy that will also drive innovation. In Denmark, we have partners as a government with Danish business setting up 13 public-private partnerships where Danish business is becoming part of the 70% push. The third level of ambition, and let me end there, is at the global policy and regulatory level, starting for us with the EU. The Green Deal has to become the engine of economic transformation, and it also has to drive innovation. We want a European target of 55% by 2030. That will be negotiated this fall. We look forward to partnering with France on doing this. And we think that Europe can become a global economic model that can help bring China, India, the emerging economies along. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This transition, energy transition, is happening at the level of companies. I believe that it's at this, in a large way, that we can find the answers to all the questions that are raised so far. Jean-Pierre CLAMADIEU, you are in charge of ENGIE. is this crisis that we're facing for a few months, is it accelerating this energy transition, or is it making it more complicated? I hope that it accelerates it. On top of not having the cigale, I am missing all these conversations that we had together last year. It's one of the lessons that we've had since the month of March. I have three major lessons that I can talk about. The first thing is I think we perceived very strongly the fragility of our system, our economies, and our way of life. And that became very clear, and we found ourselves in a situation where half of humanity was in lockdown. And even if there's no direct link between health crisis and environmental crisis, there's a real wake-up call to say, hey, watch out, we're fragile. Second point is we were capable in a few days or in a few weeks to reinvent part of our way of working and functioning, and this is quite remarkable. And this is something that should bring us ambition and courage to imagine disruption innovations. In a group as ENGIE, such as ENGIE, we put 50,000 people in teleworking in 48 hours. In normal time, if I had said, if I'd asked my HR director, how can I put 50 people in teleworking? It's going to take a month, 12 months, 18 months. We need to consult. We need to prepare. And we were, and ENGIE is a company, among others, that were capable of doing this disruption. We're capable in very little time to do this change. So that should give us ambition and ideas. Third comment, and we all know that, we talk all about the recovery plan, about massive public interventions. Some of them are here to treat as an emergency the economy, the situation of the economy and companies so they can keep operating. But we're entering a period where there's going to be public investment, direct investment through companies, massive investment, and aligned. We feel it in Europe, particularly a will of coordinating between the initiatives of the Commission and the initiatives of various countries. We need to seize this opportunity to make sure that the climate emergency be at the heart of the recovery plan. And what I feel through the speeches of everyone is there is a will to take advantage of the opportunity of these recovery plans to make sure that we go to the next step. Last comment on innovation. I am an engineer by background. I spent 20 years in the chemical industry, and I am convinced that technical innovation brought us a lot. However, I am not sure that the challenges are in the technological research, because I think that most of the solutions that will allow us to align ourselves with the Paris Agreement are here already. The challenge is double. We need to go from a demonstration stage to something that has a massive impact. We could see in the development of renewable energy, such we did with wind farms and solar energy. We may talk later about hydrogen. We don't have the system yet allowing us to use this opportunity fully. So the first challenge is development, and second is to tackle all the issues. I listened very carefully to the conclusions of the climate convention, and what struck me is the capacity for these 150 of our citizens to look at all the issues at the same time. It's not a problem of energy transition. It's not up to the leaders, it's up to all of us. How we heat ourselves, how we feed ourselves, what kind of products we're going to choose, what kind of consumption we're going to choose. Innovation is within the capacity of putting together all these elements. You would still take the 149 suggestions. Some of them I wouldn't pick. Sometimes we talked about tax on dividends, but not taxes on carbon, which struck me. But in most cases, there are good ideas. The President of the Republic made some choices among all these measures. Let's take an example. The thermic refurbishment of buildings. We have to make some major progress, but it has to go some form of constraints. I'm not surprised to see these ideas expressed in the convention. We have to know how to go further. Antoine FREROT, you're CEO of Veolia. The emergency is climate or is it economic? What about the long-term challenges? How do we deal with them? Are there some other forms of emergency to deal with? There's several emergencies at the same time because several crises at the same time. We have a health crisis that is generating an economic crisis, social crisis, maybe political crisis. But before we had the health crisis, we had an environmental crisis, hence the emergency. And crisis always created innovation, triggered innovation. Wars did that before, and because of wars, we had faster innovations. Crisis encouraged innovation as well by necessity. When there's no choice, we have to go forward and find something new. Veolia, as a matter of fact, was created 170 years ago following a health crisis, the explosion of the cholera epidemics in cities that were growing very quickly with the Industrial Revolution. And the Compagnie Générale was created to bring drinkable water at a time where we were drinking, quote, 90% of our diseases before we had clean water. And the crisis that we had afterwards, crisis on pollution with toxic waste. When I was 17, in the Seine River in Paris, when we would look at the different types of fish, there were only 3 types of fish left. Now we have 40 different types of fish. So we know how to find solutions. And I want to go back to innovations. Of course, we need technical innovations, but like Jean-Pierre said, we already know a lot of technical innovations. There are, of course, some that are missing that we still need to find, but we know a lot of them. What we're lacking is our capacity to roll them out. And to do that, we need innovation, but not technical ones. We need social innovations. Madame MASSON-DELMOTTE talked about sharing economy, institutional innovations, and in terms of pollution, because the greenhouse emission are a complex form of pollution, the institutional innovations were already put in place before. I took the example of water, and before for CO2, a greenhouse emission, the same logic that we used for water 50 years ago would be very useful. Making the polluting more expensive than working with clean water. So putting a cost on this externality that we create when we pollute. So a tax on emissions. And to make sure that depolluting costs less, I would call it a fee rather than a tax on pollution, making sure so producing by polluting will cost more than producing without polluting. And I bet you that depollution will come quickly because the economic logic will force all manufacturers to acquire the necessary depolluting equipment so they pay less money. So this system that was applied with water, that was applied to the ozone layer, to acid rain 30 years ago, if we were to apply it today for the greenhouse emissions, we would go much faster. Can it work at a national scale or at a European scale, or do we need a global system to implement it? Well, pollution doesn't know borders, so of course we'll need a world governance. But it's a bit naive at this point. So the European scale is probably the one that is the most logical one, the most natural one as of now, and that corresponds to our way of living. To protect the European manufacturers, we will need to have a carbon tax at the borders, which will have the effect of pushing the manufacturers outside of the border to also depollute. There'll be a trigger effect. And I'm thinking about the European region putting in place something that may inspire other areas such as China. So doing that, if this fee does not go into the public money, but could be spent really to depollute, will reduce the excess by 2. So we'll go twice faster, and that will be the end of the discussion. Ilham Kadri, sorry. Thank you for being here. You are heading a major chemical group, Solvay, which is based in Belgium. So this is your first trip to Paris after the end of the lockdown. I imagine that if you head a big chemical group, you understand that the crisis may accelerate things, and the necessity to put in place solutions to fight against global warming. Absolutely, our reason for being is to reinvent this progress, even before the virus became global. So looking at the crisis, there's a lot of things that were said already. If we mobilize as we did for the health crisis, if we did the same for the climate and the ecological transition, would go much faster. There was a mobilization because it touches humans and our freedom to contaminate our close ones. So there are 3 points to remember. And I represent the world of chemistry today. Chemistry is essential for this ecological transition. During the crisis, I hope rehabilitated chemistry that was seen as a polluter first, and now we realize that it was playing a key role. Most of our plants throughout the world, except for China, because the Chinese state has decided to close down all production plants and industries for 2 weeks at least, we were recognized as an essential, and no plant was closed by force because we're in food sector, we're in health sector, we prepare test kits and we modelize them, and we produce gels as well. So we have a very fundamental activity. So I believe that chemistry also is the mother of all industries, and chemistry must be at the service of circularity. If we can recycle a waste, it stops being a waste. So look at water, close to my heart and close to my background. If you do a process to take the salt away, it costs a lot of money. We have to do the same thing. We have to have a holistic view. When I was in Davos in January, everybody was talking about the climate. For 3 months or 3 or 4 months, people talk about health, sanitary measures, sanitary crisis. Does it mean that climate has been put on the back burner? In our strategy with Solvay, we have 3 pillars. Climate first, we need to continue, but we also have natural resources and biodiversity. And coronavirus is a consequence of the imbalance of biodiversity that happened in the market in the Hubei province, and that came to threaten our world economy. And third, and you said it, the transition, the energy transition may sound like a utopia, but must become global. Because such as the coronavirus, the global warming has no borders. And if the politicians of the world, even if they don't agree on the why and maybe and the cause, despite what we're told, the companies, global companies, our clients, our partners, do this global transition. And we have to reinvent the value chain. We cannot do anything without reinventing the value chain. I salute Europe, which comes with a Green Deal. I congratulate France and Germany and the Scandinavian countries, which are taking the lead in this ambition. very bold ambition that goes along with all the stimulus that are putting in place to stimulate the economy. But we need to reinvent the value chain. We talked about innovation. You need to know that innovations are here. Bertrand Piccard, who went around the world on a solar plane, he's now building a suitcase to go around the world with 1,000 ecological solutions with projects that are already existing. He was on his own in the plane. Yeah, but maybe we can carry on what he started. Now he's with his foundation trying to imagine how we can spread and roll out these innovations that exist today. And finally, all this money and all these funds that we're putting back in the economy, it's very good, but we also need to use it to accelerate the Green Deal and this energy transition. Otherwise, we'll be lagging behind.
Alors, Jean-Bernard Lévy, quand
Thank you, Jean-Bernard Lévy. When we are at the head of EDF, what do you understand by ecological transition? It's a technical topic and a political topic. I would say that in the company, it's a daily topic, and it has been one for decades now, since the effects of carbon emissions have become factual in terms of global warming. So for 30 years now, that no one really debates that question anymore. And I would say that I would agree with what my other panelists, have said, is the durability not going to be more difficult because of the economic crisis after the health crisis? Is the negative impact of the absence of a carbon tax? It's obviously we need to do it, but socially we can't. That's what people are saying. So it's a question. It's a question of concern. Could we do that at a national level? At a national level, yes. Sweden has a lot more industry in their GDP than France does, and the carbon tax is 5 times the French one. So who said that the carbon tax and industry are enemies? My second comment, I was struck to see that the negationists of the virus are also the same ones against the climate. Not always the same ones, but some can change their opinions. There's no real obvious consensus in the entire world, even in major countries, on what we should be doing. What was said about the air quality was very interesting. It's a very important question for public health. I'm not sure what figure we should be referring to, but the problems of air quality today are the cause of a high number of deaths in our country, a higher number of deaths than the virus, because it's each year, it's year on year, not just 1 year. And so from that point of view, the imported particles are a taboo subject. What are the imported particles and what is their effect on our citizens? What can we do in addition to what we're doing? I was delighted to see that Denmark, whose economy was historically based in coal and carbon, is changing. Great Britain also moved away very quickly. It was a big coal country, and they built the domination in the 19th century based on their coal industry. They were capable of doing it, so it can be an example for us. They do it with a mix of renewable energies and new investments in nuclear. Yes, they chose to invest in the nuclear industry. It's quite consensual. Some people oppose it, but most of the parties in the British Parliament are in favor of nuclear energy. So I hope that French industry will make the same choice. And the successive British governments have continued to make this choice. With respect to what we're already doing, I wonder what we can do in addition. Our energy mix is almost completely decarbonated. We'll stop coal-fired plants in the coming years, and our figures are better than our competitors. So what can we do? I think that we can try to accelerate the industrialization of innovation. As Jean-Pierre said, laboratory innovations are very important, and we encourage them, but we know that by 2030, they probably won't be in our homes or in our companies. However, the acceleration of innovations that have been made over the last 10 years is something that we can do. If we look at hydrogen, we can try to accelerate the industrialization and improve the learning curve on hydrogen. Another thing that we can do is to work more on carbon sobriety. For years now, the waste that we had in our when we were young, everyone's talking about energy sobriety now, consuming less energy for the same purpose. I'd like us to talk about carbon sobriety, but today our public policies are almost entirely focused on consumption, on the volume of energy consumed, be it in joules or watts, but not in carbon emissions. In France, the regulations that apply for buildings are not focused on reducing CO2 emissions. They're entirely focused on consuming less energy, which is good. But we need to have two pillars now, and we're very late for that. And I'll conclude by saying that we have a lot of progress to make in the presentation of what we're doing and what we're putting in front of the public. And I would like to refer to the excellent magazine that you manage to see what we're showing to the French citizens. And last Monday, you had almost 2 full pages on the closing of Fessenheim nuclear power plant, which took place overnight between Monday and Tuesday. There was a little bit of room for an ad. So alongside this decision that we know was not guided by our objective to reduce CO2 emissions, there was a little ad for the opening of a public investigation to go from 2x2 highways to 2-lane highways to 2 by 3-lane highways. With regard to the question on innovation, since you all seem to agree that this is what will allow us to make progress towards the ecological transition and to reduce CO2 emissions, how can we make sure that innovation takes place here in Europe and not 10,000 kilometers away? You talked about the electric batteries. It's great. There are initiatives in Europe, but 3/4 of batteries are produced in China or Korea. So how can we ensure that these desired innovations are actually developed here in Europe and not elsewhere? The example of the battery is an interesting one. We came to it a bit late, but the European Commission 3 to 4 years ago was in Brussels at the time, and I saw the commissioner saw the idea develop in the commissioner's mind to create regulations to really boost the sales of electric vehicles in Europe. And so we had to join that with the production of batteries. And so now we're seeing the development of 2 or 3 projects to develop batteries in Europe. A certain number of companies around the table are partners in these projects. So yes, we have the ability. Maybe we were a bit late for batteries. Also, we were also late on solar panels and wind power. I'll talk a bit about hydrogen later, but I think that there are topics where Europe has the technological bricks. We have the companies that are capable of developing these technologies, and we need to make industrial policy decisions that will allow us to develop projects that create employment and know-how in our countries. So there's another reason to develop these technologies here. The mines of the future are not beyond our territories. All of the activities, the recycling activities, to give a second life to waste and raw materials that were extracted elsewhere and we brought to us emit less greenhouse gases than when we reuse them than when we start with real raw materials. A bottle of water, when it's recycled, creates another bottle of water, producing 70% less emissions. This is truer even with metals, aluminum. So we're lucky to have the raw material here. And I come back to the example of the battery. Between Solvay and Veolia, we have a project to build a battery recycling plant. It's going to be a prototype plant. So we have a prototype plant. We're going to build a bigger one in France to recycle the raw materials, the metal, and to make new batteries with Solvay, because we will have the batteries here, the old batteries that need recycling. It's an advantage that France didn't have in the past in the classic industry, to have the idea and the raw material at the same time. It's also true for organic waste, making fertilizers. Most of the time they're made at the other side of the world, and we bring them back to our fields. Our organic waste, the sludge from wastewater treatment plants, the leftovers from restaurants can be transformed into biofertilizers. This bioconversion, we have the know-how to do it and the raw materials. And we'll go beyond fertilizers one day. We'll produce animal protein for the breeding industry. So we can bring production back to our countries because we'll do it differently with different raw materials that will be heavy contributors to the reduction in CO2 emissions. So when you hear politicians say we need to relocate, you think that's wrong? No, we need to relocate. We won't do the same thing in France that we're doing elsewhere. We'll do something different.
We'll do it differently because we will contribute to the energy transition in France or in Belgium. Ilham KADRI, yes, everywhere in France and Europe, I applaud the project, the battery project. We have a great project on recycling, but upstream, if we talk about that, it could fail or work. If we try to copy China and Korea and we're not competitive, it's not going to work. Today, Europe has allowed several nations to invest in batteries locally. I understand that each European country wants to favor the local players. It's normal, but we're going to have to be careful on making the right bet on the good technologies. And it's not the technologies that we're starting with today. It's the technologies that started 10 years ago to reinvent batteries. Those who haven't produced a battery in their life, I don't know if they're going to win. Another bet is hydrogen. Yes, the Japanese are on it. We've been on it as well. We accelerate our investment, and this is going to coexist. I don't think there's going to be only one answer. There'll be the electricity, hydrogen, hybrid technologies. It's going to be very important for Europe to start reviewing its energy policy and its energy transition policy at the European level, and not leave it up to some nations to make some bets. I remind you that money does not only come from the European Bank, we're also borrowing from our children. So it's a duty to start having a real scientific benchmark on the life cycle and the value chain. Not only say, yeah, that's good, sounds good, we have money. In 10 years, we'll remember several industrial investment that didn't lead to anything after 10 or 15 years. And you say, oh, they wasted our money. Isn't it better to make several bets? I'm, shocked to see that Germany is betting on hydrogen. They decided that we're at the right time where we know what to do with hydrogen, and maybe not reinvent the whole hydrogen sector, but to make a massive effort and Germany contributed to a huge effort to bring back solar and hydrogen solutions to substitute coal and oil or gas. And Germany is making a bet that 10 years down the road, it is now time to invest massively into hydrogen. And if it doesn't work, well, so be it. It's good that some countries have this entrepreneurship vision. Maybe France will decide to do it. With the massive funds that are going to be invested in the development of the plane of tomorrow, it may be time to see that the crisis is an accelerator of risk-taking on some sectors where before, because of competition rules, financial constraints, people were more shy to bet on it. So I think it's good that today we are going full speed ahead. Yes, but it requires collaboration. Completely. We need to collaborate. Since we're talking about technological innovation, such as hydrogen, we can mention other innovations, starting with the one of energy storage. Batteries will be a part of it, but not the only one. And capturing and storing the CO2 seems to me one of the major innovations that will help us fight the war against climate change. There are many things to do, imagine, to secure this work, to make it more accessible economically as well. It is probably the innovation that, if Germany bets on hydrogen, we should probably bet on storing CO2. Yeah, this is a trajectory that I wanted to talk about. There's a characteristic common, the residual emissions. We capture the CO2 in the atmosphere. Sometimes we reuse it, but we store it in a sustainable manner. It raises a lot of questions. There are chemical solutions, but there's also a way to have recourse to the biomass or some solution based on nature to preserve natural areas that capture the carbon. Why do I want to talk about this? Because when we talk about energy transition, as you are at this roundtable, there's a major challenge. It's food safety. We see it today in a context of health and social crisis. The issue of food security is a major challenge. The greenhouse emissions linked to food supply, there's waste and the whole supply chain. And as you mentioned, the solutions in this sector are already existing. We know what's being done, what's being experimented on the ground. And if you look at the food choices, the supply chains, the agricultural practices, we need to go faster. And emissions in France have gone down, of course, because we gain in productivity, in farming, or using better our fertilizers. But there's a huge challenge to go faster. So this sector can really play a big part. And the European level, the common agricultural policy has brought some benefits in the past on making agricultural products more accessible to feed people. There's an emergency to integrate biodiversity and climate elements, because if we want to have sustainable means of production, that will improve as well the living conditions of farmers that are very difficult, but also to compensate them for the diversity of solutions that they will bring for water, biodiversity, cold storage. I also want to finish by saying that the health crisis with this virus, respiratory virus, if you look at it, if you look at the most vulnerable people to the virus, one of the major factors of vulnerability is comorbidity is obesity. So one of the goals of one of the SDGs wants to provide a healthy food system, and it could be also about let's stop putting on one side food issues and climate issues. I want to go back to the topic of innovation and hydrogen, and I hope it's not just a topic that Germany is betting on. I think that France, should bet on it as well. I am representing a gas company, and I am convinced that gas has a big role to play in the energy transition as soon as we can green it. And the decarbonated electricity system that we have, that EDF has put in place, is we forget that we can produce gas, non-fossil gas, and that contributes to the energy system, because gas has a characteristic that is quite essential. It's easy to store. So we can, when people need it, we can free up a lot of energy very quickly, but we need to green this gas. On the short term, biogas, of course, is a solution, and we need to go faster. And the next step is hydrogen, which will allow us to do a lot of things, in particular because we can transform easily gas into electricity and vice versa. And the development of the hydrogen system has its particularities that we know, electrolysis to produce it, and a lot of European companies have a very strong positioning on this. Germany made a choice to invest 9 billion euros on that. I understand that the European Commission is going to make some announcements to put in place some systems to start this form of energy, and I think France should also join in. Companies like ENGIE, but also our friends from Air Liquide, should join and should take the necessary risk to make it part of the European energy transition. There's a card to play, and I hope that France will be on board. Patrice? Yes, I'm just wondering, our audience is going to wonder how we finance all that, and I can share with you all the calculation that we made with our colleagues from the Climate Convention. All of that is financed. In the financial forecast for France to obtain the goal, to meet the goals of 2030, we invest every year 35 billion. We'll have to go up to 50 billion. So there's a gap of 15 billion. For a country like France, we import every year between 30 and 70 billion of oil products and gas products. Let's look at 50 billion, which is the average, and we don't really control exactly that number. And the question of quality of air has a cost of about 50 billion. So if we add it all up, we have 100 billion every year into which we're going to dig. So that answers the question of financing for hydrogens and battery and circular economy that we already talked about. So I think that if we need to send a strong message to the citizens, is we're not in the after-war period. We're not about doing a Marshall Plan and turn tables around like we did in 1945. It's an effort on the long run that includes, maybe shifting 1% of the GDP. 100 billion is 4% of our GDP. So, and the vision is to have a clean air. And there's some continents which are still fighting over clean water. We are trying to fight to have clean air. We experimented for a few months having a clean air, and Jean-Bernard Lévy was saying that mortality is 50,000 deaths per year. And the non-drinkability of air, or the non-cleanliness of air, if I may use this word, is part of what we experimented. Jean-Bernard Lévy, I wanted to go back to something that Valérie MASSON-DELMOTTE just said. and I know she plays a very important role at the Climate Council, is the use of the land. You talked about it with the very interesting comparison between obesity and comorbidity from the COVID. I don't think we can avoid we won't be able to avoid a debate on the use of land. What part of the land should be used for man to feed himself, and the unique, which is the way we use it today, or the use of land to produce energy from different technologies. And I think that today we're shying away from this debate. So let's try to combine it, which is one of ambition with EDF. We're trying to grow some cereal, we're trying to grow some cereals under solar panels that would be a bit higher than they are now from the ground. I think combining use of food and energy on agricultural land is a subject that is worthwhile looking into. Yes, 34% of the energy consumed in the world is also useful to the food supply. So we need to feed more people with less water, less energy, and less soil. Yeah, it's the same idea with forests. We can wonder what quantity of wood do we want to use for energy and the other for food purposes. So in a changing climate, some of these issues become more complicated. We also talk about changing the soil. We also said we're not talking about the fact that the forest is gaining ground over cultivated soils. We have a few minutes left. The government is preparing a recovering plan for September. If you could say a word to the new prime minister, what would you tell him? What would you suggest to him to make sure that his recovery plan is green? He needs to have something to recover from. Well, he's going to need to save the French economy and the SMEs. Some of them, some of the small companies are working at reduced speed. If they don't have more subsidies, they're not going to survive. We also need to think about how to complement the aid that was given to these very small companies during the lockdown, and we're going to have to go beyond that. The Germans did more to support their very small companies. They also funded the fixed charges. So what would you suggest to make it green then, this recovery? Once we've aided, helped, and saved companies, everything that we said today, I would insist on the energy refurbishment of buildings. There's a huge potential. There's potential of payback as well, a good return on investment. That would be financed by the energy saving that it generates. And there's we've been talking about this issue for a while. We need to be disruptive. The infrastructures that will allow our cities to be more sustainable, that should also be implemented. And the recovery plan has to have such measures. What is your message? We already worked in this direction, and the 2020 report, in the context of the pandemics, we will release the report next Monday, and there's an analysis of the potential actions for recovery, for co-benefits, to reduce the greenhouse emissions, but also in terms of employment. There's also an analysis of the different dimensions of what could be a fair transition, or a transition that is perceived as fair. And the last pillar which is close to the heart of the new prime minister, is the role of territories and regions in that transition. So, that's the news. Yes, there's a point of convergence between building refurbishment, which is also a factor of inclusion. 3 to 4 million of the French population lives in a situation of energy precarity. So if we move in that direction, we'll address this issue as well. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you, Radio France, to welcome Aix in Paris.